So The Massacre is a very interesting serial. Well, when I say interesting, I mean because it's somewhat messy. The serial was written by John Lucarotti, one of the show's best historical writers, but was heavily rewritten by Donald Tosh. The end result is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of plot. We'll definitely have to touch on this writing process, because it will explain the odd plot. What we ended up with is something which doesn't feel like Doctor Who, but is still utterly great. But to understand why I think that, we need to get into the serial and examine the plot. So where to begin with The Massacre? The serial is a bit messy, with a plot with a lot happening. Obviously the TARDIS landing tends to be a good place in this era of the show. The Doctor and Stephen find themselves in Paris, August 1975, days before St Bartholomew's Day. Uniquely for the show, the two of them, once knowing their location, change into clothing that is fitting of the time and place. Well, mostly Stephen. The Doctor just alters his usual attire with his cape, a hat and a very nice cane. Stephen's outfit is definitely something very different to what he's usually seen in. I'll note it here, but the serial does have a lot of very nice costumes. So the Doctor and Stephen find themselves in a tavern where several characters, Gaston de Lorraine, Simon Duval and Nicholas Muss, are drinking to Henry of Navarre and his marriage to his Catholic princess, the Princess Marguerite. We do get a lot in this tavern scene. The Doctor decides he's going to find a man named Preslin, leaving Stephen alone to interact with Gaston and company. So for some context, Nicholas and Gaston are Huguenots, something we learn when Duval leaves them and tells the landlord to keep an eye on them.
Certainly you must serve them, but watch and listen. Report to me anything you hear or see.
Certainly, anything, sir. Here in Paris, we know what is right. Though, for people like myself, with a living to earn.
Of course. But what's your business?
So I should probably explain some of the conflict of the serial here to make things make a little bit more sense. The Massacre is about the religious war between the Huguenots and the French Catholics in Paris, leading up to the events of the St Bartholomew's Day massacre. The marriage between Henry of Navarre and the Princess Marguerite was in order to try and calm tensions between the two groups. When toasting to the marriage, Duval is the one to mention the princess causing this.
Henry of Navarre, and to his bride, our Catholic princess.
Clearly this marriage has not calmed tensions that much, since Gaston chokes on his drink in disgust, something which only fuels Duval's distrust. The group drinking together is far more of an act than an actual moment of being brought together by the marriage. In fact, Nicholas explains it well to Stephen.
10 years ago at Vassy, a small town some miles south of Paris, 100 Huguenots were slaughtered by the Catholics.
Why? Because they were Huguenots.
With that conflict explained, the Doctor has reached Preslin's shop, where Preslin is cautious of him. This is due to Preslin being a bit of a radical for the time, discovering and naming germs. It's only a short scene, but it's interesting, as it shows the views of the time through Preslin's fear of the Doctor until he knows what sort of a man he is. While not connected to the religious conflict of the serial, it does reflect that conflict in how Preslin acts towards people due to his own beliefs. This is one of only 3 scenes with Preslin in the entire serial. He has no presence in the serial beyond this. Why is this? Well, Preslin just exists so that they can get the Doctor away from Stephen due to Hartnell having a 2-week holiday. In fact, Preslin's presence is just confusing for the rest of the serial, as he seems to not even exist. Plus makes other details very confusing for the final episode, but I'll come to that when it's relevant. The next scene which features Preslin is only a few moments later, with the Doctor being told about the Abbot of Amboise.
The Abbot of Amboise is the Cardinal of Lorraine's right hand. With the Cardinal in Rome, the Abbot has decided to come to Paris. We shall be hunted down. That man is far more dangerous than the Cardinal.
With this being his final scene.
You showed the old man the way? Good. I only hope he succeeds. You were not seen? Let's hope not. You've done well. Good luck, old man. Good luck.
Basically just a line. Meanwhile, Stephen is still in the tavern where things are heating up with the arrival of a girl named Anne Chaplet, who is fleeing from guards. She is a servant of Cardinal Charles de Guise, which gave her the opportunity to overhear a conversation which gave details for the titular massacre. This is why she's running. Gaston and company hide her. This allows them to get some information out of her, before sending her to the house of Admiral de Coligny for safety. Later, Stephen is waiting for the Doctor at the tavern, but he's nowhere to be found. This situation is worsened by the fact that there is a curfew, with Stephen having nowhere to go. Fortunately, Nicholas returns and offers his friend a place to stay for the night, also informing the landlord to keep an eye for the Doctor.
It's the curfew now. You must come with me. You can always come back here in the morning. Landlord! Yes, sir. If an old man arrives asking for the Englishman, tell him he's lodging with the Admiral de Coligny and will return here in the morning.
Yes, certainly, sir.
This basically ends episode 1, but we have one final scene between Duval and the Abbot.
Forgive me, Father Abbot, but the missing girl is at the house of Admiral de Coligny.
Fetch her tomorrow. Bring her to me.
So this is definitely quite the cliffhanger. So either the Doctor is pretending to be this Abbot, or he has a lookalike on Earth. We'll just have to find out. From the opening of episode 2, the differences between this serial and most others is very evident, made clear by the lack of a recap of the cliffhanger. something that only happened either at the beginning of a new serial or that one time in the master plan, which split the two separate sections. This is certainly unique, and admittedly it is a bit refreshing during a viewing of this serial. With it being a unique element, it makes the serial stand out while giving it a bit of an odd feeling, with the plot of each episode just beginning right after the credits finish. This decision does get each episode off to an immediate start, with cuts between locations and time being a lot cleaner. The episode 1 cliffhanger takes place just after the curfew has begun, while episode 2 begins the next morning, so the change in time isn't anywhere near as distracting as it might have been otherwise. It's not for everyone, but I quite like it. The feeling it gives is just something different. So episode 2 is The Sea Beggar, one of those titles which doesn't have meaning until the end of the episode. This episode is where the conflict escalates considerably, with Stephen being pulled directly into it. This all occurs after a man named Colbert, a man we saw following the Doctor from the tavern, leaves Nicholas and Gaston. Stephen sees the Doctor outside of the Admiral's house, but when the others look, they recognise him as the Abbot.
That's the Doctor talking to Roger Colbert. I must go to him. Thank you for all your help. One moment.
Gaston is of course suspicious of this due to the Abbot being an enemy of the Huguenots, so accuses Stephen.
You say that man is your friend? Yes. And how long have you been working for the Abbot of Amboise?
But the only problem here is that the Doctor was in the tavern with Stephen before, so shouldn't have Gaston have seen him there? In fact, we know for certain that Nicholas had seen them together, so shouldn't he have been suspicious of this far sooner? But despite this, Nicholas does give Stephen the benefit of the doubt and goes with him to where Preslin's shop is to find the Doctor. But when they arrive, they discover that Preslin doesn't live there. In fact, he hasn't been for some time.
Where is Preslin now? How long since he's lived here?
Oh, a long time. 2 years about.
So as I said earlier, Preslin's existence in the serial only confuses things, because he clearly was in that shop only the previous day since the Doctor found him there. So is this woman covering for him? If so, she went all in with it, believing him to have been burned, and should have been if he hadn't. Now this could be the reason, but the serial doesn't confirm or deny it. In fact, she's only in this scene and never addressed again by anyone. But either way, this puts Stephen in an even worse position than before, with Nicholas now distrustful of his friend.
Your friend is the Abbot of Amboise.
No. It is just possible that the Doctor is pretending to be the Abbot.
For what reason?
Where can I find the Abbot?
So that you can get further instructions.
Nicholas, please believe me.
This leads to Stephen having to escape, which causes him to overhear a conversation which discusses the assassination plot of the Sea Beggar. Stephen, still being loyal to Nicholas, goes to report this to him, but with him still out, he decides to leave a note, but is caught by Gaston.
What are you doing? Where is Nicholas? I have some important news. I'm sure you have. And I've got some for you, too.
Get out of here!
Look, you don't
What
understand.
paper are you looking for?
I was
Spy?
trying to leave
Some more
a
information
message.
for your Abbot?
Look, listen to
I'd
me.
rather listen to a pack of screaming devils.
Gaston, there is
Get
a...
out of...
For heaven's sake.
Now interestingly, Nicholas does somewhat still trust Stephen to an extent, as he believes Stephen must have been there to leave a message for him, despite what Gaston believes.
Englishman. Stephen. Yes, I caught him here.
What did he say?
Say nothing.
Why did he come
He
back?
was spying. I caught him going through your papers.
He must have had a message, otherwise he'd never have
I
come
tell
back.
you, he was going through your papers.
Stephen said he'd come back here if he found out something important. Did he say anything?
Nothing.
These two are a great pair, each of them are very well rounded, so you understand why each believes what they believe. They are similar in some ways, but different in other key areas, which is why their treatment of Stephen can be so different, while both having a distrust of him. Now for the title of the episode. So while the Sea Beggar has been referenced throughout, being one of the main plot points, we don't actually find out who that is until the end of the episode. The final scene, in fact. The Sea Beggar turns out to be Admiral de Coligny.
After I'd explained the situation to him, he turned to me and he said, "If we do ally ourselves with the Dutch, you, de Coligny, will go down to history as the Sea Beggar. The Sea Beggar. It's a title I'd be proud of."
Definitely a lighter cliffhanger. It's kind of surreal how it just ends without anything too big. Episode 3 is probably the fullest episode with the most of happening. Notably, we have the attempted assassination of the Sea Beggar, which within the story is what really kicks off the massacre. The assassination fails due to luck, but the Admiral is injured. We also have Stephen trying to meet with the Abbot as he still believes him to be the Doctor. Having run into Anne in the previous episode, the two spend the night in Preslin's shop. Then the next day he basically risks her life to meet the Abbot, who turns out not to be the Doctor, but Stephen still refuses to believe it. Throughout the episode we also have several scenes in the council chambers, with King Charles and his advisors discussing matters. Notably, we have the discussion, or rather the argument, about the political and economic issues concerning France's military aid to the Dutch. But far more relevantly, we have the discussion of the persecution of the Huguenots by the Catholics. These scenes feel a bit odd as we haven't met a decent chunk of the cast within them. Charles only appears in these scenes, which also goes for the Queen Mother. But I think the Queen Mother really shines in episode 4, so I'll discuss her more there. Charles isn't the most interesting, but he plays an important part in the religious tensions. Of course we have the marriage, which was an attempt to try and calm tensions, but this didn't work. But Charles is more relevant with the Admiral as he is a close friend of the Admiral, so when he learns of his attempted assassination, he basically turns on the Catholics.
And, Marshal, since you claim to know nothing of this attempted assassination, I have a special charge for you. You will be responsible for the Admiral's safety. Empty the street of Catholics, station your men around his house, and mark me well. If anything further happens to him, you pay with your head.
This being something which the Catholics within the council can use to their advantage, including the Queen Mother. So it's important to note that the Queen Mother is responsible for the assassination attempt, which is something Charles is fully aware of.
The attempted assassination of my Admiral by you and Tavan? Do you deny it, madame?
No.
Have a care. I do what I say. I shall send Tavan to the block.
You would execute the Marshal of France for doing his duty.
Duty? He's an assassin.
He tried to rid you of a dangerous enemy.
Sir Coligny is my friend. You, madame, are my enemy.
The tension between these two is high, worsened by the fact that he can't realistically do anything against her or the Marshal. With those two covered for the meantime, we have to discuss the Abbot. So Stephen, who is still on the run for his life, ends up finding a crowd who have gathered around the body of the Abbot, who has been killed. Seemingly it was done by several people according to the crowd, but Colbert points Stephen out as the killer, causing the crowd to turn on him and forcing him to flee, leaving behind the person who he still believes to be the Doctor. This is the cliffhanger for episode 3, and it's definitely a strong one. There's a high sense of dread and tension as the character who may or may not be the Doctor has been killed, which could leave Stephen stranded in Paris just before the massacre. The lack of the Doctor's presence in this story, or any character who has any knowledge of the time zone, really helps with this dread. Stephen is just unable to understand the world around him, which forces him on the back foot, unable to turn to anyone for help, seemingly having betrayed the only person who trusted him. The one problem is there is a lack of a ticking clock, since the massacre isn't exactly built up to in the sort of way that other big events in other historicals have been. Unless you know about the massacre, then you haven't got the information which creates the ticking clock. So episode 4, there is a lot to discuss here, because this is basically where the plot sort of breaks apart. There's less going on than in the previous episode, but what happens clashes with what has happened, or leaves it unexplained. We begin with Stephen returning to Preslin's shop where Anne has spent the night alone. The two of them discuss what has happened, with Stephen having a sense of hopelessness as he has no idea where the Doctor's clothes are, so he can't find the TARDIS key, meaning he's stranded. Fortunately, this is when the Doctor just walks into Preslin's shop.
Because Preslin is either dead or in prison.
He is not.
Doctor!
So the Doctor's return is odd to say the least. He just returns and announces that Preslin isn't dead, but doesn't explain anything about what he's been doing or where he's been the past few days. The only thing he says is that Stephen should have stayed at the tavern, which would have caused this entire mess to be avoided. Stephen obviously argues back, and you can't blame him. The Doctor literally just disappeared for days. Since the Doctor doesn't explain anything about what he's been doing or anything to do with Preslin, it means that this entire plot is just confusing. Preslin clearly wasn't dead, as that woman said, and he was living in the shop only the day before. So what happened to him? Did the Doctor help Preslin to escape Paris or something? But then why did this woman lie to Stephen? Nothing is addressed about this. Then there's the Abbot. Stephen mentions him, but the Doctor doesn't respond to this comment. He clearly isn't fazed by the fact that there is someone in Paris who looks just like him. So was the Doctor the Abbot? But if he was, then why was he the Abbot? Nothing makes sense here. The serial was clearly hinting towards the Abbot and the Doctor being the same person, or at least some subversion of that suggestion, because there's a scene which addresses the Abbot's arrival in Paris, implying it being somewhat recent.
The sea beggar lives. You have failed. Call the guards.
It is strange, Father Abbot, that since you came, everything which had been so carefully planned has gone wrong.
But anyway, this is where we get another big issue with the serial. This is when Anne tells the Doctor about St. Bartholomew's Day tomorrow. Upon hearing this, the Doctor realises that he and Stephen must leave immediately, due to the incoming massacre. But how doesn't the Doctor know this? He seems to be familiar enough with the time that he was able to find Preslin's shop, and Preslin himself, despite the fact that his neighbours seem to think he's dead. Plus, since he's discussed the Abbot with Preslin, he must know when he is, as the Abbot plays a key role in the build-up to the massacre. The Doctor's entire presence in this serial is just confusing and is the weakest part of it. So with this sudden revelation, the Doctor and Stephen return to the TARDIS, with the Doctor making the decision to leave Anne behind, something Stephen is very unhappy about. I'll talk about this more later as it goes well with a later scene, During this, the Queen Mother puts her plans into motion for the massacre. This is a very interesting scene as we have the Queen Mother basically giving the order for the massacre. I haven't talked about the Marshal too much in this discussion, but this is a good scene for him as we see his different view of the upcoming massacre from the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother views it as a black and white thing. All Huguenots must die, while the Marshal only views some as a threat to the Christians.
What is this?
For this, madame, when those Huguenots are killed, we need have no further fear of a Protestant France.
We have no need of lists, Marshal. The good people of Paris know their enemies. They will take care of them.
Good people? Madame, if you rouse the mob, the innocent will perish with the guilty.
Innocent? Paris, they can have no innocence. France will breathe a purer air after tomorrow.
He even insists that Henry of Navarre shouldn't be killed, going behind the Queen Mother's back to ensure his safety.
When you have passed on the order, I have a special charge for you. My lord. Henry of Navarre.
I'm to have the honor.
Yes, but not of killing him. You will escort him out of Paris.
But my lord!
You don't hear me. You will be responsible for his safety. Dawn tomorrow, this city will weep tears of blood.
The serial has mostly been through the eyes of the Huguenots, but this gives a good insight into the divide of Christians' view of them. This scene does work to lessen the black and white view that is being given to the audience, which changes the context of the massacre somewhat, since it's not a universal view of the Huguenots, but instead we find that not all have this extreme view of them. This is quite dark, with perhaps the standout moment being the Queen Mother ordering the gates to be closed to prevent the Huguenots from escaping. This is maybe the darkest the serial gets. Back in the streets, the Doctor and Stephen manage to get to the TARDIS and leave Paris, with the next scene being this. All the characters we've come to know across the serial. Nicholas, Gaston, the Admiral, all were probably killed. I'm not sure if I can call this a dark moment as it's incredibly brutal instead. The screams as Huguenots are massacred by the Catholics. It's incredibly intense. Something you really wouldn't expect, or at least shouldn't expect, from a show like Doctor Who. It's such a raw scene. This era really is the darkest serial of the Hartnell era. The final TARDIS scene is quite long. The plot basically wraps up about halfway through the episode with the massacre, but the TARDIS scene is amazing. With a focus on Stephen throughout the serial, it means we have a very strong connection to him, and how he's feeling about the Doctor right now. Often the show is shown through the eyes of the Doctor, but this is definitely through Stephen's. There's a lot to unpack here, but a lot of the conflict revolving around Anne, who the Doctor refused to take with them, despite the fate she was almost certainly going to face. This is the breaking point for Stephen, deciding to leave the Doctor once and for all.
I tell you this much, Doctor. Wherever this machine of yours lands next, I'm getting off. If your researchers have so little regard for human life, then I want no part of it.
It's such a great moment. Compared to the others, which left on more happy terms, the fact that Stephen is angry with the Doctor, somewhat despising him, he decides to leave, not caring where he goes, just so long as he leaves. This leaves the Doctor alone for the first time ever in the show, giving us a very unique moment for this incarnation. We see him drop his guard and open up, even if just to himself. His final words to Stephen are interesting.
My dear Stephen, history sometimes gives us a terrible shock. And that is because we don't quite fully understand. Why should we? After all, we're all too small to realize its final pattern. Therefore, don't try and judge it from where you stand. I was right to do as I did.
It shows his greater knowledge from his age and travels. It's a final piece of advice to Stephen. Then the Doctor, now alone, thinks about his companions, considering going back to his home planet.
Even after all this time, he cannot understand. I dare not change the course of history. Well, at least I taught him to take some precautions. He did remember to look at the scanner before he opened the doors. No, they're all gone. All gone. None of them could understand. Not even my little Susan or Vicky. And as for Barbara and Chatterton, Chesterton, they were all too impatient to get back to their own time. And now, Steve, perhaps I should go home. Back to my own planet. But I can't.
It's such a calm moment. After a serial full of dark moments and action, with everything being incredibly tense, how everything calms down without it feeling out of place is amazing. It's one of Hartnell's greatest performances. But this moment is short-lived as something has happened outside, causing a young woman to rush up to the TARDIS thinking it's an actual police box. This is Dodo, our new companion. I won't talk about her much here as she's only in this episode for a few minutes, but it's a bit of a weird scene. She doesn't really react to the TARDIS being bigger on the inside, and the Doctor is really casual about her presence in the ship.
Who are you?
Where's the telephone?
What did you say?
The telephone. I've got to ring up.
Oh, pull yourself together, child. I think you've made a mistake.
I'm not sure if this is just inconsistent writing or character development, given how dramatically different this is from Ian and Barbara's introduction to the Time Machine. I like to view it as character development due to the fact that the Doctor has changed considerably in these seasons, so this is just good confirmation of how much he has changed. Stephen, having seen some policemen approaching the TARDIS, returns to tell the Doctor to take off. This of course completely undercuts the previous scene, but as a Stephen fan, I'm not complaining that he's still a member of the crew. Without even thinking about Dodo, the Doctor takes off, giving us this scene of a woman watching in puzzlement.
Quick, you've got to take off. Oh, so you come back, my boy.
Yes, I'll come back. We can't go into that now. There are two policemen coming over the common towards the TARDIS.
Coming here? Good gracious, they want to use the telephone. Exactly, thank you.
Well, I assume puzzlement? It's hard to tell with a still image of her back. Dodo gets a small introduction telling the others her name, which is in fact Dorothea Chaplet, with Dodo being a nickname. Stephen, for some reason, believes that she is the descendant of Anne, which is seemingly the case due to her having French family, meaning Anne did survive. I'm going to admit that this is a bit silly. There's also this probably retroactive fourth wall break, with the Doctor saying that Dodo looks like Susan, which is due to Jackie Lane, who plays Dodo, being up for the role of Susan at one point, but dropping out due to the length of the contract. With that, the serial ends, going from a very dark and gritty story to something incredibly light in the last few minutes with Dodo's arrival. But there is still a lot more to talk about, mostly behind the scenes. Obviously, we have the writing process of this serial. As mentioned at the beginning, this serial was written by John Lucarotti, with it being heavily rewritten by Donald Tosh, who was script editor at the time. This rewriting is almost certainly what caused the very confusing script problems. Tosh rewrote it due to him believing it to be historically inaccurate, which John Lucarotti disagreed with, nearly pulling his name from the serial due to the rewrites, but was convinced to keep it on. Tosh is credited for the final episode. This is due to his contract as script editor ending, meaning he could now have his name on scripts. Now, I haven't read the novelisation which was done by Lucarotti, but apparently it's nothing like the televised version or his original script. The next thing to discuss is Paddy Russell, the show's first female director. Unfortunately, with the entire serial missing, it's impossible to say how good her work was, but I wanted to note her as she would go on to work on the show into the Fourth Doctor's era. Plus, being the first female director of the show is also worthy of praise. Without the footage, there isn't much that can be said, but I want to bring up this about Hartnell. With this being the first time working with a female director, he said it was a bizarre experience, but did get along well with Paddy Russell. This good working relationship is definitely why the scenes with the Abbott seem to have turned out so well. Russell was able to keep Hartnell's two performances very separate, as Hartnell were going to the Doctor while playing the Abbott. The title is something I would bring up, but I think that's something that's been talked to death about. Obviously I call it The Massacre instead of the longer title, partly because I have difficulty pronouncing it all the time. The last thing I want to discuss is the location filming, notably the TARDIS prop used for the location work. So everyone knows this prop is less accurate to either the TARDIS prop or any other police box. The reason for this prop's existence was because the TARDIS was needed both in studio and on location, so the prop was split in half. But this is not actually the case, as confirmed by YouTuber David Gillespie Pratt. This TARDIS prop is in fact not part of the actual prop. In fact, it's a new prop of sorts made using the TARDIS porch, which was made for the An Unearthly Child pilot episode. This scene does also feature another interesting behind the scenes fact, that being the woman watching the TARDIS dematerialising was a friend of Paddy Russell. Plus, as we all know, it was originally intended for Ian and Barbara to see the TARDIS take off, but this didn't happen. Overall, The Massacre is a bit of a mess, but a fun mess. It has many problems, mostly in terms of its script, which falls apart when you think about anything in it, but the dialogue and characterisation is so strong. This is the closest thing to an actual Donald Tosh serial, so I do welcome this oddity of a serial. It's messy, but it allowed Tosh to show what he could do. It's definitely not a true Lucarotti script, lacking his informative nature in his writing, which made his historicals what they were, but it's not bad at all. It's a serial which doesn't feel like Doctor Who, but in a way that draws you in. It's so much darker than what's around it, and what came from this era of the show. This is what makes the serial so engaging despite everything working against it. It's one I really want to return to the archives. But with a new companion, the TARDIS heads to the time of the end of Earth, landing on a ship called the Ark. Next time, the Ark.